Big smile.
Always happy. Hi everyone, dober večer, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight with Vincenzo Latronico. It's also a great pleasure to be here at the INDIGO Festival, and thank you everyone for coming. It was, I think, publishing Perfection or Popolnosti, the Slovene translation done by Renko, is one of the best things No Press did, and I'm really happy we published this book. And I'm very happy we published it because it's the book that opened up so many conversations among my friends, different generations. There were several people who were telling me why they loved the book. There are people who were telling me why they hated the book. Everyone had opinion on it, and I think this is very important, and this is why we do it. And I'm very happy to be able to talk about the book in such a big audience today. I think this book definitely deserves it. Vincenzo told me yesterday that he's the second most successful contemporary Italian author after Elena Ferrante.
It sounds like I'm boasting. Like this was private information.
And yeah, I was boasting myself, I'm bringing this cool kid here. And my first question would be, does this information about you and Elena Ferrante being this big export writers in Italian language, does it actually tell us something about Italian literature in general or the publishing world, or how would you comment on that?
Well, thank you very much, Manca, and thank you all for being here. This is it's incredible. I'm really, really honored and happy. As for your question, it's something I think about a lot because in many ways, I felt before, when writing this book, it was also kind of a protest against something, which is that today, or at least in the world in which I grew up, so the world of the late 90s and 2000s, international literature seemed to be mostly American literature. These are the authors I grew up admiring and thinking, oh my God, I want to be like them. They were Zadie Smith and David Foster Wallace and Thomas Pynchon and Don DeLillo, mostly men also. And the impression was that Italian literature was interesting only in so much as it offered some kind of picturesque, some kind of local character, the streets of Naples, pizza, the gondolas, the Madonnas crying blood, this kind of Italian thing. And when I wrote Perfection, I was like, what can I write that is mine? Because of course, I think it's important to write something that you know and that you feel strongly for, but that is not this kind of Italianness. And for me, the story of Berlin, the novel is set in Berlin, and at a pivotal time in the life of Berlin in the 2010s, when it still felt that it could become the actual cultural capital of the unified Europe. And that's a story that belongs to Italians, and it belongs to Slovenians, it belongs to Spaniards, and it belongs to Greeks. But it does belong to us. It doesn't have that, it doesn't have the Madonna's crying blood, but it's ours. And what I see in this kind of recognition is that maybe there is, this seems to be a sad moment for the European ideal. And I see most of you looking at the ages from the little I can see, we grew up with the idea that Europe was a utopia that would keep improving, would keep integrating. We had different currencies, we had borders, and this stuff is, we grew up seeing all of this go down, and we thought it would go on, at least I did. And then, right now, my friend who lives in Koper, who is there and will drive me tomorrow, said, yeah, now, we have to take more time because at the border, there's very often controls. And I think that part of the reason why this book resonated so much is that this age, when we thought optimistically, maybe naively, of the European project, was an age that deserves representation. It's something that had to do with our growing up.
What I also found very interesting is that when you first published Le Perfezioni in Italian, it was book that was averagely successful or not a bestseller.
Yeah, let's say not a bestseller.
And then 2 years or 3 years later, it was published in English, and all of a sudden it resonated. And it seems now that it's gaining more coverage in Italy now than it did when it was first published. So why do you think it was so important for this book to be translated into English language? And from your experience, since the book is translated now in almost 40 languages, in what kind of national context is it popular? And I'm asking this especially because what many of us found great in this book is that Anna and Tom, the protagonists, they don't belong to any nation.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's many questions in there. So I will start with the one part of the answer, which is, this book has been very popular in English and in Greek, and for the rest, only and mostly in formerly Eastern European countries, in Slovenia, in Poland, in Hungary, in Croatia. And I have my ideas about that. I think that also in my experiences, for instance, the interviews were much more serious and in-depth. Like I've had much better feedback from my readers there. But to come back to the main point of your question, I think that this depends on two things. On the one hand, Italian media, just like German media, are very, very much influenced by American media. So a German magazine would not cover the book of an Italian writer, but it would cover a book of an Italian writer reviewed in the New York Times. And this, of course, is what it means to be a colony. And this is the one side. On the other side, I think that, this book is about this decade of naive optimism, at least for, privileged white Europeans and Americans. The 2010s were a period in which we kind of believed in progress. We had seen Europe unite. We had also seen technology bring positive change to our life. Facebook was about connecting people and not about enabling the doxing of anti-genocide activists. Airbnb was about traveling very cheaply and meeting people, not about gentrifying whole cities and destroying the livelihood of and this was true, this was fact. And we kind of, at least I did, believe in it. And when I wrote the book, I wrote the book in 2021, during the lockdown, in which we did not really know how the pandemic would be an endpoint for that optimism of that decade. The invasion of the Ukraine hadn't happened. The genocide in Gaza hadn't happened. And so it felt that the time I was writing about was kind of still going on. Yes, there had been the first joke Trump presidency, but Biden was president again. Things were kind of normal-ish in the neoliberal order. And now I think that we can all see that that time of naive optimism is completely over. And the book has kind of become, I think, a eulogy or an epitaph for an age of naivete that now seems kind of sweet. And it now seems very, very far. I wasn't aware that this is what I was doing when I did it. But in retrospect, it's what happened. And I think that this is the difference between 2025 and 2022.
Now, when you were talking about it, I remembered how a friend of mine told me that her friend, this friend used to live in Berlin, and her another friend still lives in Berlin. And she said to her, "Oh, please don't read this book. You will start missing Berlin so much." And I didn't read this book in a way. Of course, parts of it resonate with the golden era of illusion of Berlin that probably never existed, but we believed that it existed. And what people often write about or say when they talk about this novel is that it's also a generational novel. And I have, in general, some difficulties with the concept of the generation. And I'm interested in how you felt. Like, did you want to write the generational novel, or is every novel that a person of our generation writes a generational novel anyway?
I mean, this is a very good question. And I think that when I was writing it, I would have rejected this label very strongly because it's also kind of a simplification. Of course, a generation is made of people of many different classes and many different origins, and these things matter more than the year you were born in, to a certain extent. But now, in retrospect, so one of the things, or at least, let's say, 3 of the things that mattered to me when writing this book were, 1, to write about what Berlin felt like at that time for a European who said, if I can, I'll just grab an EasyJet, find a sublet, and see where life takes me. And this is something that was kind of cross-generational. Many people didn't do it, of course, but everyone kind of had a friend who did, or everyone maybe partially would have liked to if their life had been different. And this was one. The other thing that really interested me was to write a story of growing up together with the internet. You know, I remember when, and now I'm gonna sound old, but like, I remember when you had a dial-up modem with that funny sound and you connected to a BBS to download the very first MP3 tracks, which were, for me at least, the soundtracks of cartoons I would watch as a child. I remember when Facebook finally accepted subscribers that were not from .edu emails, so that you could actually subscribe if you were not an American student. And all of a sudden you would find old friends from childhood and people with your same name in Argentina. Like, are we related? And I remember when in the afternoons after school, I would teach myself how to do HTML in order to change my GeoCities page and to put like some nice GIFs on it. And this for me was, I didn't write it to represent a generation. I wrote it because these were things that mattered to me growing up. And also seeing, for instance, how all of these competencies that as a teenager you have as a hobby, at some point become a job. And you realize, okay, some people are actually making websites for money. I thought it was for fun. And I wanted to write about these things because they mattered to me. But then I realized, of course, that these things matter to a big section of the population, at least the ones whose families were privileged enough to have a computer in the late 90s. And so, to answer your question, I would be very suspicious of somebody saying, I have decided to write a generational novel. I think that, but ultimately, for instance, there's a big historical group of novels in Italy that are the novels about the resistance, the partisan resistance to fascism and Nazism. And I am sure that all the writers who wrote those books did not want to write a generational novel. They wanted to write about something that they had lived. But of course, a whole generation, at least like, you know, the good part of that generation, had lived through the resistance. And so they ended up being like that too. I don't want to compare myself to these like huge names like Italo Calvino, but I think somehow, if you write about something that matters to you and that it's very often an experience that is shared by the same segment of citizenship.
Indigo Festival is known for its design talks, so many designers here give great presentations. And of course, Anna and Tom, the protagonists of your novel, are designers. And I wanted to ask you how did you choose their profession? And did you know from the beginning they have to be designers because design is so closely connected to the internet and everything you just said? Or or did you just choose them to be designers because everyone in Berlin is designer or DJ?
No, I think it's for the first reason. I mean, I think, so the book is a rewriting of Things by Georges Perec, an incredible book about the consumerist revolution and how it has impacted people's minds in the 60s. And the two main characters there were advertising people, which was a new industry. You know, it was something that and what's fascinating about that book is that it shows two people who are part of the, let's say, avant-garde of a transformation in society, but they are also not the victims, but the objects of this transformation, because these advertising people also have their own desires shaped by advertising and start dreaming of these leather chairs. And in a way, I think that, so I wanted to have protagonists who have all the tools to understand digital life. They can understand why a design is super enticing. They can understand why a change in the interface of a social network can make it much more addictive. But then they are also addicted. Because I think that this is the paradox, at least the political paradox that many of us face, or at least that I face, is that all while you know that social media are addictive, are flattening, are possibly serving a reactionary agenda, you still do it, or at least most people still do. And this is often framed as, a failure of the will. Oh, if only I were a better person, I would not be on Instagram. I don't think that this category is interesting. I think it's interesting to see how you can have this kind of double conscience, in which at the same time you are aware of everything that is going on, but still your awareness is not enough to resist it, because the forces against you are much, much stronger than your own knowledge. And I wanted to kind of represent this paradox. And so I wanted to have protagonists who had an immediate understanding of all the subtleties of visual culture in which we are embedded, and those are graphic designers.
But they also produce a visual culture that is unifying the experience of the entire generation. Like, in a way, this sort of millennial design, Berlin design, the way that you describe, like the types of designers they are, I think that it represents very well the aesthetics of the certain era that now almost already seems a bit archaic or old or even cringe.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a historic piece in this sense. It's like about when teal was cool, and Helvetica. It's. But I mean, I think that it's. I think it's kind of. I mean, yes, they're not very good designers. They're kind of they follow the wave. They're like soldiers in this unification battle. But I wouldn't think that they would be responsible for it. I mean, I think that this is it's kind of a paradox, not a paradox, but like a categorical misunderstanding that we often make. Like when we say that gentrification is the fault of the artist who moves to the derelict neighborhood or of the expats. And so we blame it on individual action. Gentrification is the fault of the government who allows housing to become a speculative financial asset instead of like a right. And at the same time, I would say that this kind of homogenization of culture, which is one of the most striking elements of today's era, and I think that we don't reflect about it enough, because, I grew up politically in the 90s. We fought against globalization, and we considered globalization to be represented by McDonald's, in which you have the same exact look in Rome and in Milan and in Moscow and in San Francisco. But that look was designed in a single design office somewhere in America and kind of beamed down to every location. Whereas what was interesting in like the first big Instagram era in the 2010s is that you would have the same cafe with the menu written on a blackboard and a Monstera plant and reclaimed wood and metal rod furniture. You would have the same cafe, and we've seen them in Stockholm and in Berlin and in Rome and in Buenos Aires. But these would not be beamed by a central office. All of the independent owners of those cafes with the craft beer and natural wine and the slow roast organic single origin coffee were thinking that they were doing something extremely individual, something that really just represented them. And this is and I don't say this as a criticism of these people, because, like my apartment is like that, or was like that. Now it's a bit more Memphis, of course. But
you're a best-selling author after all.
Fake Memphis. In Milan, they're easy to find. But I mean, I think that we don't think enough about this paradox, that we managed to recreate the homogeneity of McDonald's without a central office. And this is a little bit the paradox, one of the paradoxes that is at the center of this book.
When I was reading the book, what I particularly like from the emotional perspective was that I felt that you have sort of tenderness or empathy towards the protagonists. You're not. It didn't seem to me that you're judging them, their lifestyle. they, it seemed that you empathize a lot with them. At least this was my impression. And then a friend of mine said, no, he hates them. And I would just like to make it clear, could you tell to my friend that I was right?
So, I mean, I want to make a premise, which is that I think that the book, when you publish it, it's like, you know, a submarine. You have no contact with it. So your friend is not objectively wrong in that if your friend did not understand my intentions, it's likely my fault that didn't make them clear enough. And I think this is a good principle for like the interpretation of texts. On the other hand, I did aim for that tenderness for, let's say, I mean, one practical reason and one theoretical reason. The practical reason is that even though the book is fiction, every detail inside it is true. It comes either from my life or from the life of my friends or the people around me. And if you use, I think that as a writer, you can use anything, so never trust a writer in your life, but you should use it ethically, so not to make a cheap laugh. And so I felt this kind of responsibility in using all these real things, not to just make simple satire of them. Also because many of them were from my own life. And this is, let's say, the practical reason. The theoretical one is that this is the biggest difference between my book and Perek's. Perek's book was very judgmental. The two characters appeared as fools, brainwashed by consumerism into dreaming a material life that would never make them happy.
And he ends with quoting Marx.
And he ends with
just to make sure that.
And he ends with quoting Marx. But this is because Perek was a Marxist and could imagine a radically different society and a radically different political standpoint from which to judge these characters and the society they're part of. I can't. I mean, I do support any kind of socialist or extreme left-wing reform, but I cannot really imagine a society that is structured radically differently from the one in which I live. And so I don't really have like a position from which to critique these people. I don't want to kind of say, you're in the cage of capitalism, because I am in the cage as well. So maybe I can describe like what the bars of the cage feel like around me, but I mean, I don't know where the door is. I don't know if there is a door.
Yesterday, we talked a little bit about the expectation of being a very good artist, like how whenever someone decides to be a writer, an artist, or someone that the society would expect them to succeed, not to be an average artist. And you are developing a theory comparing arts to sport, and I would encourage you to try to explain that to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it's strange. Now, since March this year, I can consider myself a successful writer. Since Perfection came out in Italian, I was a writer who was on maybe his way, like an emerging writer. And until 2022, I was an utterly failed writer. Like, I had not been able to finish a book for 8 years. I lived on extremely little money, doing odd jobs here and there. I considered retraining for another job. And so all of this made me think that, I mean, of course we like to think of the individual genius and the individual successful artist, but like, art is something that a community does. And the wider the community is, the likelier it is that something great comes out of it. Which means that for every great work, for every great artist, you need a lot of normal artists, which is, or should be, completely okay. And if we look at the past, if we read like of the writing community around Gertrude Stein in Paris in the 20th century, or like, we understand this, but there are some unrealistic capitalistic expectations placed more and more recently on artistic work, which go counter to this. So we have the concept of a failed artist, somebody who tried and just wasn't good enough, just didn't have it in them. And this person is a failure, whereas we don't consider a failed athlete someone who throws the javelin and went once to a national competition and then didn't qualify for the Olympics and keeps working as a trainer in a gym. This is an athlete. It's someone who practices her thing. And we don't make fun of a javelin thrower because nobody goes to see javelin competitions in the same way that we make fun of a poet for doing a reading in front of nobody. I think that, and it's interesting because sports are the only exception that we make to the idea of capitalistic productivity and success. Whereas before, at least, you had religion too. You don't ask a priest, like if your child wants to be a priest, you don't say, how much do priests make? Will you be able to have like a second home? You know, it's something you do for another reason. And I mean, I don't know how it is in Slovenia. I have the impression that culture is more valued and more supported by the state, for instance, than it is in Italy. But in Italy, this has drastically changed in the past few years. And yeah, it's something that doesn't bode well, because the fewer normal artists you have, the fewer great artists you have.
It's also, Zoran also has a theory, like he always says, that in order to have great popular culture, you have to have good underground culture, and vice versa. There is no counterculture without the mainstream culture, and so on. And I think this is sort of the part of the same problem. Another question that I have is about the language. You wrote a long essay on Italian literature that we already started with, like the expectations of the picturesque Italian villas and love stories or grandmother's partisans and so on. There is another thing, which is language in general. How I would say that if a writer is of our generation, let's say, and successful, all of a sudden the question of the language appears as in, are you going to start writing in English now, or why do you keep writing in Italian?
Yeah, I mean, but I wanted to reconnect to what you just said about Zoran saying of the relationship between the counterculture and the main culture, because I think this is something that I think about a lot, and it also connects to perfection in a way, that I think that somehow the book is also about one of the last phases, at least in the West, of a phenomenon that had always been intrinsic to the experience of the metropolis, which is the coexistence of wealth and poverty, of the aristocrat and the tenement where the poets and the prostitutes live, which you find in Balzac. It's like 3 blocks away. And you find them in New York as described by Don DeLillo in the 50s and 60s, and you find it in the London of punk. And this is where, like, this is what why cities were an element for the democratization of culture, because all of a sudden, culture was not just made by aristocrats living in their castles, but you had poor people who could come to the city, experience culture, like make a spark for this friction between the high and the low, and something happened. And all of the cities in the moments that I described are seen now as crucibles of creativity, from Paris in the middle 19th century to New York in the 50s and 60s to Berlin in the late 90s and early 2000s, which was, in many ways, one such place where music, where art, where literature were made. I would not be the writer that I am now if I hadn't experienced that. And that was made possible by the simple materialistic circumstance of extremely cheap rent. I know that this sounds like a simple explanation, but it's true. I mean, a developing artist, musician, writer needs time, and you can have time if you don't have to have 3 jobs in order to pay 1 rent. And people often ask, where is the New Berlin? There is no New Berlin. Every metropolis in the West now is super expensive, and I think that we will feel the cultural impact of this in a decade, in 2 decades, because the material conditions for the productions of artists are often no longer there. And in many ways, I mean, I feel extremely lucky to have been able to catch the last train to Berlin in many ways. But I think that the sadness in the novel, because there is a lot of sadness, is also the sadness about what to me seemed like the end of this idea of a city as a place of contradictions and of extreme class differences and extreme class mobility and extreme cultural and social mobility, which now seems to be no longer the case. And I mean, and what you said about English is somehow an aspect of this, because, I mean, we're talking in English here. Like, what are we talking about? We're neighbors. Why are we talking in English? Because we are two peripheries of the same place. And I mean, I'm extremely happy that No Press bought Perfection before it was published in English. But in many, many of those countries in which it is translated, it has just been bought because the book came out in English, it was well reviewed, it was finalist at a prize in English, and then kind of everyone adapts that. And of course, I cannot complain. I was very lucky. But I feel that somehow it's as if we are all at the periphery of a single center, and even if the peripheries are close to each other, culture has to pass through the hub of the center in order to get somewhere else. And I mean, something similar was happening in Berlin as well. You know, when I moved there in 2009, Berlin was still mostly, and which is the period in which the book starts, and there's like a section in the book about this as well. It was still something in which the immigrants, or the expats, were mostly French and Italian and Greek. And so we got by on this kind of okay English that we had, with accents, with mistakes, and you could get jobs at a gallery, at a restaurant, at a magazine with this English, because this is what was, and we thought this is the European cultural capital. English, our bad European English, is our common language, the one that we're speaking now. And then the Americans came, and all of a sudden, everyone's language was actually someone's language. And all of a sudden, you would be competing for a job with someone who has a native language, and they have a birthright, like a blood right to this qualification. And all of a sudden, this industry that seemed to be thriving in European English belonged to someone else. And of course, some people learned German and integrated, but this European utopia of like a collective culture was not really aware, at least naively unaware, that we weren't building a collective culture. We were building an English-speaking culture. And so long as it's like based on language, well, some people are going to use it better than others.
For my last question, before the public gets the chance to ask their question, I would, you talk a lot about the cities. It seems that you're a person who loves the city, loves Milan, loves Berlin, the person who enjoys it, but yet recently you've been interested in the topic of moving to the countryside, to write about moving to the countryside.
I mean, it's because I tried to move to the countryside. With a group of friends, we bought a house in ruins in Mecklenburg in the northeast of Germany, and we spent 2 years trying to renovate it. Of course, it went catastrophically. I mean, it's the joke writes itself, right? But I think that, jokes aside, I think that there is a truth to that, because, I mean, as you have seen, I am obsessed by real estate. But it's also because I think that in many ways, I mean, I am a privileged European white man, and I can legitimately see the history of the past 200 years as a history of progress in rights. Workers had fewer and fewer rights, and then from the 1950s on in Italy, acquired them. And you know, you had a right to health insurance, you had a right to good working conditions, you had a right of the basic social compact of if you work, you are housed. Then maybe you are a bus driver and you have a small apartment outside of the center, or maybe you are a cardiologist and you have a huge apartment in the center. But this was part of like the acquired rights of every worker. And I feel that my generation is the first to see this right eroded. My dad was a welder and my mom wasn't working, and we could have an apartment with a bedroom for me and one for my sister and 2 cars on his salary. This in Italy is science fiction now, you know? And we grew up with the idea, of course we will be housed, and now it is a privilege, no longer a right. And I think I see that this also means that like the city as a technology for producing interactions and sparks between different spheres of society is no longer the case. The city is now more and more homogeneous and more just center. And so I think that the countryside is the natural solution to that, especially now that many people can work remotely. And I mean, I don't know how it is in Slovenia, but the more in Italy cities become completely insanely expensive, the more the countryside gets drained out of resources and actually becomes empty. And I think that if there is possibility for like social transformation and for like a different form of life, at least right now in Italy it's just in the countrysides, in the city it's no longer possible. And so this is why I'm also interested in writing about it, because I think it's one of the few things, together with the movement against the genocide and the climate actions, that make me see some political hope in a generally bleak situation at the moment.
Now I would like to open the floor for questions. So if any of you who read Perfection, sorry, I'm always using the plural. This is normal in Slovenia, by the way.
Oh, it's normal everywhere.
Okay. Oh, there is one person in the back seat, so.
Oh, hello, I'm first. Very interesting talk. I was just coming here to look at the space, and then I ended up staying here the whole time.
Thank you.
So I thought it was very interesting what you were saying about these cities and their time periods that they experienced with and that common denominator was the housing, which you could look back at that period in Paris, New York in the 60s, and then in Berlin. I still feel like there needs to be some solution as far as, their communities coming to the city. You're talking about going into the countryside, but I still find that connection that was made in the past. How is that going to take place, in that type of situation where, sorry, I'm having a hard time explaining my question. How do you see that, evolving? Because there is something that brings us to a city. There's still something exciting about that, and there's still that mix of culture. And yes, it's become completely unaffordable, especially in the West, but it is a solution that I believe can be solved by governments. They just choose not to.
Yeah, of course. I think that when I was living in this, I mean, you really have a point. And of course, like going to the countryside is not that big a solution in so much as you will be maybe isolated, but no political solution seems to be coming up. Like one of the most interesting political movements before the climate action and before the mobilization for Palestine that I have seen grow in Berlin, and that to my knowledge has no equivalent in other countries, but I hope to be wrong, was the so-called Deutsche Wohnen und Eignen movement, which was an enormous movement that brought about a referendum to expropriate the biggest landlord in Berlin, which owns 200,000 apartments, which is insane. Like 200, and the referendum was won, and of course nothing was made of it because it was unconstitutional. And the law was passed, the so-called Mietendeckel, to block rental prices, and it was struck down by the Constitutional Court. But this just shows that, of course, there is no political will to do it. But yeah, I think so. You have to find a way around. I think I had seen a hand down there.
There was a question there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I have to out myself, I haven't actually read your novel yet. I basically just came here.
The important is buying.
Yeah, no, I came here because of the Guardian article you wrote a couple of weeks back, and it also dealt about English, and because it echoed something that I said recently somewhere else, and I think it's really like the Anglo-Saxon world for so long ignored translations. Like I could write a sermon about literature and translation as a term, which I absolutely despise, because we had French literature and whatever. But so to circumvent this, let's say this English language tastemaker, give us three Italian authors you're excited about now and that haven't had this English global exposure yet?
Well, I mean, Alba de Cespedes, who has also been translated by No Press, but I'm not doing it for this reason. And Anna Maria Ortese, I don't know if she's translated into Slovenian. She's incredible. She wrote this book about called The Iguana, which is a love story between the dumb heir of an Italian aristocratic real estate family and a talking iguana who becomes his servant. And it's a fable about class and about the relationship between nature and culture, like very short, super funny, and she's great. And like actually Elena Ferrante, she was from Naples and she wrote a lot about poverty in Naples. And you can see that Elena Ferrante read her very closely. Like it's, and I was surprised that she didn't get like a kind of wave of success after the so-called Ferrante fever. And then maybe Paolo Volponi, who wrote the metaphor for climate change that I still find the strongest in the 70s, I think, or the 80s, called Il pianeta irritabile. He also was a director of the Italian Communist Party for a while. Thank you. That's such a good question.
We have another minute for questions, so if anyone else would like to ask a question. If not, Blaž? Yeah?
No, grazie mille, caro Vincenzo, cara Manca. Allora un po' italiano adesso. Spero che... Še eno vprašanje.
Sorry, Blaž.
Hi. I read the book a while ago. I didn't read it in Slovenian, but in English, sorry. And I felt sick reading it. So
Thank you for the publicity.
It's very flat, the way you write it. And I hated the characters. Because I was in Berlin at that time, a bit later. So the Americans came. They already came. Yeah, the bad stuff. I lived in the Hinterhof, 6 times moved. You know, I've been there. And then the best life that you could have would be this life. You know, the life that they were living. Like, yeah, I changed my profession. I became UX writer because that was the job that you could maybe get if you were native German or native English, of course. And I think, you know, how can we go someplace and not be, even if you go to the countryside, how is this the good life? What will be the good life in the countryside? We're isolated, we like nice things, and we think this is the good life. But I felt sick when I read it because that's exactly how I felt in Berlin. And I said, I have to get out of here because I'm going to go insane living this good life that's isolated. And I don't know, we didn't even speak German, most of us.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that you nailed you nailed the point. What makes my characters unhappy, what made me unhappy in Berlin, what probably made you unhappy, was the lack of a community, was this idea, this illusion, this myth that happiness is an individual achievement and not a collective achievement of which you can be part of. Or like that happiness is only defined as a person and not as a person within a community. So it's not a property of an individual. It's a property of it's a relationship between an individual and a group. And this is what's missing. But of course, my characters do not have the way to articulate it because we grew up in such like an obsessive individualist mindset that we consider happiness to be a personal achievement. And these characters are in a way, you know, what is authenticity? It seems to be such a central term today, and for my characters too, like the quest for authentic experiences, an authentic life, which of course means nothing, but the dissatisfaction, the pain that motivates the quest for authenticity is real. And the reality of it is that it's just a loneliness in a time in which every collective structure has been dismantled, from labor unions to political parties, to a very big extent also to religion. People are lonely and they think, oh, well, maybe if I buy this nice thing, I will be happier. But like it's kind of a hamster wheel. And what makes the book, the reason why the book makes you angry, I guess, is that because it reminds you of that feeling of being in a hamster wheel. And it's also the reason why I left Berlin, ultimately. Thank you. That was a really good question.
So before Caro Blaž takes the stage, I would like to invite everyone to the cafe later, right now actually, because Vincenzo will be signing the books for those of you who have them, and for those of you who don't have them, they will also be, you can also get them there. And also No Press just published another book 2 days ago. It's Pogovori s Bogom, written by Eva Mahkovic. So those of you who would like to get that book, it's also here. And I think I've seen Eva somewhere as well. So yeah. And now Caro Blaž, the stage is
Grazie mille Vincenzo per la vostra partecipazione meravigliosa. Grazie a Manca, Vincenzo Latronico e Manca Renko.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.